If we've learned anything during this eventful political season, it is that religious beliefs are increasingly part of the public discourse, part of how candidates are identifying themselves, how religious communities are identified as coveted voting blocs, and as part of how we as believers and citizens frame issues and try and make sense of public problems and conflicts in ways that have integrity for us. So it's in this context that LTSP has oriented our whole curriculum around public theology. That is, how our Christian faith is constructed and expressed in the public forum. To generate our community-wide conversation around that this year, we have a Convocation series that will focus on Scripture and public theology, or especially how to, in Karl Barth's words, to approach God and the world with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. I cannot think of anyone to kick off this series and start our conversation, anyone better than our own Bob Robinson, who is the Anna Burkhalter Professor of Old Testament and Hebrew. Bob is well known to everyone here except the new students who will quickly know him well. And Bob joined the faculty in 1989, bringing with him his wife, Jo, who's trying to slip in unnoticed, and 3 children. He came from having started his teaching career at University of Missouri, but prior to that, he had a BA from Ursinus College, an MDiv, and a PhD from Yale Divinity School. In his years here, almost 20, Bob has become known to us as a curious and diligent scholar, especially focusing on the book of Genesis, a dedicated and a caring teacher, a leader in this community and on the faculty as chair of the biblical area and now part of the singing group, the Codeines. A non-anxious pastoral presence in our community, and a pretty good farmer. But most importantly, known to us as a child of God. So please join me in welcoming Bob, who will speak on Bible and civic virtue.
Kitty and I aren't sure whether codeine is a prophecy or a present reality. First, let me welcome you and express my own delight at this community coming back together. It's an empty place in the summer and quiet. And when you come back, the community is restored and enlivened, and it becomes alive. And see old faces and friends and new people to get to know, and it's just a delight. So I welcome you all back. It's really wonderful to have you back. Let me also, I want to pay tribute to Jerry Lutz. He's been very much on my mind. Jerry was in a small seminar in Isaiah that I had last spring, and I'd learned to respect him. I went to visit him a couple weeks ago, and this is in tribute. I can't say more than this. In Jerry's death, in his approaching death, Jerry was a witness to the gospel. He was in tremendous pain, but his faith was strong. Just a remarkable man and a gift to this community, and as sure as anything with God now and delighting God. So I do want to remember Jerry today and pay tribute to him for the witness of his life and his death. Posted prominently on the bunkhouse wall in John Irving's novel, The Cider House Rules, is a list of rules the workers at the cider house are meant to follow. They are all quite sensible laws. Do not smoke in bed. No sitting on the bunkhouse roof. They are also roundly ignored. The bunkhouse roof catches the cool evening breezes after a hard day in the orchard, and off in the distance are cheery Ferris wheel lights revolving wistfully at the county fairgrounds. Smoking in bed? A singular contemplative pleasure to end a long day. No one pays the slightest attention to the posted rules, but it cannot be said that the orchard and its workers are anarchic. The cider house and the orchard, it becomes clear, are governed by an unwritten code that is no less effective for being unwritten. A code everyone working the orchard shares and acknowledges, even if sometimes in the breach. In a memorable scene, those who've seen the movie or read the book, in a memorable scene, a cider house worker sits watching a large vat of cider fill from the cider press that's kind of creaking and wheezing behind him. Casually, he tosses his cigarette butt into the swirling cider. Instantly, Mr. Rose, who is the foreman of the cider house, is all over him. I wanted to say like a pig on slop, but I thought it lacked dignity. Don't you know your business? He shouts. His voice is just full of anger and menace. Don't you know your business? Or another moving scene. Mr. Rose is picking apples along with the rest of the crew. Homer Wells, who's the central figure of the book, angles his ladder into the same tree. And he climbs up close so that he has Mr. Rose's ear, and he confronts him about the incestuous relationship Mr. Rose is carrying on with his daughter, Rose. Again, Mr. Rose is all menace. What business is that of yours? Yet this incest is not a private matter. It offends the sensibilities of the workers who, if you remember, they lean off their ladders to listen to the confrontation. To the things that must be said if there is to be order in the orchard, a moral order. Later, Mr. Rose is stabbed by his daughter, but before he dies, he honors the code that Homer had invoked by shielding her from the blame for the attack on him. Some men passing through cut him up. The unwritten code. No rule posted in the bunkhouse says that you can't throw your cigarette butt in the cider vat. Presumably the state of Maine has a law against incest, but Homer Wells does not invoke it in his confrontation with Mr. Rose. Homer invokes a code to which both he and Mr. Rose are bound. Mr. Rose knows that what he is doing is wrong, that it offends the sense of right of the whole community, but no external rule can force him to end his abuse of his daughter. Nor is it any external rule that leads him to do the right thing, as we would say, when his daughter ends the relationship with his own knife. Where does this code come from, and what is its nature? It's a very complicated question. For one thing, the code is not uniform. It is not everywhere the same. Human experience shapes the code, and human experience, as we increasingly realize, is itself not uniform, as if something called human nature always took the same expression. The code exists within particular communities. There is a cider house code, just as there are cider house rules. Throwing your cigarette butt into the cider is an egregious effect just there, in that place. Don't you know your business? It might not be somewhere else, although it's hard to think where it would be a good thing. Other aspects of the code still expressed within individual communities are more universal. The prohibition of incest would be part of the code in I think, all communities. The code is largely unspoken, or at least normally not articulated in explicit rules, but it is public in its nature. When Homer climbs the ladder to confront Mr. Rose, he carries the authority and the convictions of the community with him up each rung. The code is also formed by stories and traditions of the community, its hallowed memory and collective lore. My local congregation here in Philadelphia still recounts the story of the founders of the church who disembarked from a sloop called the William and Sarah in Philadelphia Harbor in the fall of 1727, an intrepid band of Germans in an English city. Recounting that bit of congregational lore helped form the vision and fortitude that allowed the modern congregation to move back into inner city Philadelphia in the 1960s, when all the church growth pundits of the time were saying it was smarter to follow the migration to the suburbs. That oft-retold story had the power to shape and embolden the congregation, a power to recreate the congregation, to endow it with character and certain indispensable virtues, courage in the face of an uncertain future, commitment to one another and to a common purpose, trust in the care and goodwill of God for their enterprise. You will sense, I hope, that we are finally coming somewhat close to my theme for today. Let me state it quite directly. Throughout its history, the Bible has functioned to form and strengthen the code of the community of faith that has treasured the Bible as its scriptures. A code that is composed of distinctive virtues and values, dispositions, and generative images. Part of my thesis is negative, although I won't explicate it very much, that when the Bible has been treated as a set of explicit or implicit rules designed to compel and mandate specific behavior, in abstraction from that underlying code, it has functioned more like the cider house rules, largely ineffective and honored more in the breach than in compliance. My interest, however, is not centrally in this negative history, which has often been present in the history of what we might call Christendom, but the more subtle and, to my mind, legitimate ways in which the Bible shapes the code of the community, instilling and fostering virtues that find their proper expression in the common public life of the community. I've spoken of the code already as being constituted in part of certain virtues, but I've been reluctant so far to define that term. My hesitancy stems from several different considerations. First, there is no agreed list of virtues that might be examined to identify a defining common element. As I said earlier, the code varies from community to community, and sometimes what one community considers a virtue would be regarded as a vice by another. In the New Testament, for instance, humility is one of the primary virtues, while humility was appalling to a Homer or an Aristotle. Even so universally accepted a virtue as courage can have very different expressions in different communities. In some circumstances, committing individuals to participation in war, in others requiring a principled opposition to the test of battle. Still further, I am skeptical of the reductionism of a firm definition of virtue, as if virtues were somehow relatively simple, nameable things that are what they are by dint of a still further reduced core quality or definition. As you will see when we turn to the Bible itself, my interest is the reverse of abstraction or reduction, to consider virtues in the light of the full complexity of the biblical literary forms. Still, we need a provisional definition of the virtues, and I will adapt here a functional definition given by the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre. He begins, "A virtue is an acquired human quality. The virtues are not innate, but must be formed. They reside in the human being himself or herself." The further definition, "the possession of which and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices. Pretty dense. Let me unpack it a little. Virtues are functional in achieving goods, and they are teleological. Oh, I love that word. They are teleological. They aim at achieving determinate ends. By practices, MacIntyre means all sorts of human endeavors, from playing games to structured social interactions such as governance. And by internal to practices, he means something like the virtues are coherent with the core purposes of the practice. I know it's dense. For instance, I can perhaps bribe you into sitting up with your elderly grandmother for a Saturday night. Or you can do it because of your familial loyalty. Familial loyalty is internal to the practice of family organization and is a virtue, while bribery is external and is not. See the distinction? You get the same behavior, but you're still sitting with your grandmother, but there are two different motivation structures. And what he wants to talk about is the ones that are internal, that come out of the institution itself. The point here is that virtues function in coherence with the practices of which they are a part and do not exist independently of those practices. Okay, that's the densest part, I promised. Now let me focus on the part of MacIntyre's definition that characterizes virtue as an acquired human quality, and turn it to our question directly. How does the Bible serve to instill those human qualities which we recognize as virtues within the Christian community? There's no simple answer, and it's not a simple question. The Bible shapes us in many different ways. My assumption is that through many different literary forms, the Bible depicts and evokes a projected world that people of faith either enter imaginatively and receive not simply as one possible world among others, but as the normative representation of the real world in which they live. Rather, we do not encounter that projected world as brute experience, as uninterpreted events. Rather, the biblical world is presented to us as a place which is itself governed by a code, a world that manifests both certain values and certain fundamental relationships among characters, both human and divine. The Bible forms us towards that projected world by making it part of our experience. I know that assertion will rouse a flurry of questions. Are you saying that we must accept the biblical world, the biblical depiction of the physical world as normative? Does that not involve us in the most inflexible fundamentalism? Or, even more troubling, I think, are we required to make virtues of such undeniable features of the biblical world as a profound patriarchalism, with the resultant invisibility of women in that projected world? Or must we consider virtuous the unquestioned acceptance of a social structure based on unchallenged hierarchies, including slavery? I take these questions very seriously and can only say that nothing requires us to enter the biblical world uncritically or naively. To the contrary, regarding the Bible world as normative makes imperative the continual task of recognizing our contemporary experience within it, what Hans-Georg Gadamer called the blending of horizons. Yet within the community of Christian faith, that alignment of worlds has traditionally occurred under the presumption that the biblical world is foundational for our relatedness to our contemporary world. If I may use a loaded word, that the biblical world is privileged over other potential views of the world. What I hope to show as we turn to specific ways in which the Bible forms distinctive virtues is that privilege is not oppression. They're not equivalent. So let's consider a few biblical passages. Near the beginning of the book of Joshua is a very strange incident. 2 spies are dispatched from the Israelite camp to infiltrate Canaan and report. Their dispatch is itself somewhat strange, since spying is normally a prelude to a military campaign. Spies are to bring back information about the enemy's weakness that can be exploited in battle. That's what spies are all about. As we learn later, the Israelites are not really going to conquer their own land. Their attack on Jericho is more in the order of a cultic procession, sort of a Sunday school procession around the sanctuary, than a military campaign. God will supply the force needed, and we would assume God has no need of independent intelligence from 2 spies or anyone else. In any case, the spies arrive at Jericho, and they take shelter in the home of a prostitute named Rahav, where their going and coming will be less conspicuous than elsewhere in the city. Rahav is quite a savvy character, and when she discerns their purpose in the city and evaluates the likelihood of their success, which I would say is about 100%, given that God is behind them, she enters into a negotiation with the 2 spies on matters of mutual benefit. At the center of that negotiation is a single key term, chesed, usually translated in this passage, deal faithfully or the like. The negotiation is quite simple and direct. If you will show chesed to me by not destroying me and my family when you overthrow the city, which I know you're going to do, then I will show chesed to you by not calling the guards that are at the door downstairs. Deal or no deal? The relationship between Rahav and the spies is very explicitly and formally defined. It sounds very much like a contract. More frequently, the obligations are more implicit and therefore open-ended in the Bible, a matter of acting in accordance with the nature of the relationship. Toward the end of Genesis 24, Abraham's servant is negotiating a bride for Isaac, Abraham's son. He finds out that Laban, the father of Rebekah, to whom God has directed him as the chosen bride, is a near kinsman of Abraham. Tell me, he says, if you will act chesed ve'emet, faithfully and true, with my master. With my master, not with the servant here. The servant is a representative of the primary relationship. Laban has certain obligations to Abraham as a kinsman, including, we are supposed, this seems a little strange, providing a wife from among his daughters. Laban is expected to honor his familial obligations, and if he does, he will be manifesting chesed, which we here consider a virtue. Incidentally, earlier in the same chapter, the servant thanks God for leading him to Rebekah. God's direction is called chesed, again towards Abraham. The relationship towards which God is acting faithfully is defined by the promise to Abraham, which includes the promise by God to make Abraham a great nation. God now acts faithfully and concretely within that relationship of promise by providing Isaac with a wife. The relationship that carries with it expectations and obligations can have many different characters. In 1 Samuel 20, chesed is based on the bond of friendship, a berit Adonai between David and Jonathan, Saul's son. David asked Jonathan to honor that relationship, to act with chesed within that relationship by acting as spy to report his father's intentions towards David, which are not good. In this case, the bond of friendship, the berit Adonai, supersedes Jonathan's duty to his own father. I think that shows how complex the expression of virtue can be. In other cases, the manifestation of chesed is based on what we would be tempted to think of as political relationships. 1 Samuel 15:6, for example, Saul warns the Kenites to separate themselves from the Amalekites, whom he is about to attack and annihilate. The reason for this infrequent act of largesse in battle is given as the Kenites' own previous behavior. When the Israelites were wandering in the desert after the exodus from Egypt, the bond the Kenites had aided them. That act of Hesed is now reciprocated by Saul, recognizing that a bond had been struck at that time, and even earlier if you read the story, which continued to obligate him. The relationship here is in some sense political. It involves two distinct political groups, but notice how the virtue of Hesed transforms political relationships. In realpolitik, Saul has no obligation to spare the Kenites. It might not even be in his own political interest, yet the obligation to act with Hesed supervenes. Thus far, I've been speaking primarily of Hesed as a virtue manifested within human relationships. In the Bible, however, Hesed is far more frequently used to describe God's relationship with human beings. Oh dear. Collect, will you please? Indeed, God's Hesed appears prominently among the virtues by which God is identified in God's self-manifestation at Mount Sinai. We all remember this. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, Hesed, and faithfulness, ve'emet. These two terms occur repeatedly together. It's probably a hendiades meaning one thing, faithfulness. Keeping Hesed to the 1,000th generation. The Lord, keeping Hesed to 1,000 generation. The praise of God's Hesed is a steady chorus in the Psalms. It was in our refrain this morning when we sang, in refrain to Psalm 26. It's a steady chorus in the Psalms which repeatedly identify God's Hesed as the grounds of God's gracious act towards God's people. God's Hesed towards God's people, expressed through promises and the fulfillment of promises, through multiple acts of favor and graciousness, and by an invincible will to maintain and restore the relationship with Israel, even when Israel breaks it, is a premise of the biblical story. Hesed, God's Hesed, is a premise of the whole biblical story. In turn, the substance and reality of Hesed is enacted in every act of God towards God's people, so that Hesed comes to be defined narratively in the concreteness of individual events and actions, not as an abstraction, but as a quality of God's action towards God's people. Hesed, then, has a divine model, a reference point outside of human interactions in all the perceptible ways that God acts faithfully towards God's people. Hesed as a human virtue, then, derives its definition, its own definition, from God's actions towards us. In my opening example from the Cider House Rules, I tried to stress that the code of virtues and values was inextricably bound up with a community that shared those values and virtues. Homer Wells did not confront Mr. Rose alone, but with the whole community of the Cider House holding up the ladder, if you like. Hesed also always involves a community as the locus of the relationships that carry with them the obligations that are to be faithfully honored. Even what seems like a highly personal relationships between like those between David and Jonathan are based in institutions of friendship and camaraderie that transcend the individual. They don't make up the relationship friendship. The relationship between the code and community warrants considering several biblical models of community. Again, I'll concentrate on the Old Testament. At the end of the paper, I will also want to suggest some New Testament developments. An obvious organizing principle of the book of Genesis is an introductory formula that recurs at the beginning of relatively large blocks of material. The formula is, these are the generations of so-and-so, some personal name there. The formula presents the unfolding story as the history of a big, if not always happy, family. Genealogical passages, you remember all those chapters that you skipped. Genealogical passages depict the familial relationships, mostly sons, alas, only a few daughters, second cousins, aunts, uncles, of all the peoples of the earth. Nations, peoples, and individuals are all interrelated through the family ties of their ancestors. Even the heavens and the earth find their place within the family history framework in Genesis 2:4a. The Bible then encourages us to think of what we would normally define as political, or more abstractly, cultural relationships as family relationships. And family relationships have a different set of obligations and investments than our usual assumptions about political relationships, the way we usually think about nations being related with one another. Consider a case of shifting national allegiance or alliance. If the relationship between the parties is viewed as preeminently political, then such a realignment may be seen as the usual expression of national political pragmatism, a necessary bowing to expediency. So, for example, during the Second World War, we allied with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. And after the Second World War, we allied with the Germans against the Soviet Union. Political expediency. But if the realignment is seen as taking place inside a family, the same movement becomes betrayal, abandonment of a relationship based on deep ties and not just political calculation. It can happen, but it has a different character within the family. The Old Testament then contains many instances, but let me give one instance of just such a judgment. In the obscure little book of Obadiah, I once wrote a paper on Obadiah, and nobody had written anything on it in about 4 years, and nobody wrote anything on it for about 4 years after that. So I was the reigning world expert on Obadiah. Talk about 15 minutes of fame. Well, it's an obscure little book. The Edomites are identified in Obadiah as Esau, the brother of Jacob, and condemned for siding with the enemy when Babylon attacked Judah. In realpolitik terms, Edom would have been insane to choose any other course. This is like siding with Panama against the United States. It's that big a mismatch. Within the family relationship, however, Esau was condemned for betrayal of his brother. Although not all family relationships are healthy or just, as the Bible well knows, the ideal of family loyalty and responsibility introduces a different set of virtues and values into the relations of nations and peoples, a different way of conceiving that relationship, a way of breaking out of the ordinary way of conceiving that relationship. Or another biblical model. As the Israelites wander in the wilderness after their freeing from Egypt, they are something like a mad rabble. They are grumble against God, and they make life bitter for Moses, their leader. Herding cats, you sense, would be easier. Or maybe herding snakes, since there's something really poisonous about the people in this period. Then at Mount Sinai, this multitude of anarchs becomes a nation, able to act with common purpose and a sense of mutual obligation. What happened? At Sinai, God offers a covenant. If you will keep my commandments, which are not yet named, then I will make you a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, a peculiar treasure. Such lovely language. Surprisingly, the people act in concert, and it's the first time since the banks of the Red Sea that they have done anything together except grumble, if you consider that doing that together. The people act in concert, and they accept God's offer before they hear what those commandments, those pesky little commandments, will be. It truly is a most unexpected and remarkable moment. The people then prepare themselves. Moses delivers the commandments that God has spoken, and in another remarkable moment, the people ritually affirm the covenant that God has proposed. At the end of the service, representatives of the people are able to go up on the mountain and share a meal with God. A holy nation indeed. It's just one bright, shining moment, but it really is a shining moment. The holy nation constituted at Sinai has a determinate character, which is largely established by the laws to which the people agree. Now, I can sense, I think, what you're thinking. Aren't the Sinai laws just like the cider house rules, an attempt to control a community by an external authority, and just about as likely? And I think this question occurs particularly to Christians. Aren't they equally irrelevant? I would reply that the Sinai laws are not community controlling, as if the community existed prior to the giving of the laws. They are community constituting. They create the community and they give it a determinate character. They are, in a way of establishing the code. That character depends on the priority and centrality of the relationship to God. The first commandments given to Moses, the 10 Commandments, begin by defining the relationship with God, what we call the first tablet of the law. And then in what are sometimes called the second tablet of the law, relationships within the community are addressed. If there are 2 tablets, there is only one covenant relationship. And both how we stand related to God and how we stand related to one another are inherent in the covenant, with the relationship to God seen as central and prior. The priority of the relationship with God shapes the community, driving it in the direction of equality and justice. Suppose that you are more rich than your neighbor. Does this mean that you are closer to God in the covenant community? Well, no. How about if you're smarter? That's my favorite. How about if you're smarter? Well, again, no. How about if you're white? No. Male? No. Democrat? No. Republican? No, no, no. Pick your category. I already said that because John McCain's mother the other day said that it was all for God and country. You know, what the volunteers were doing. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Pick your category of privilege, and the primacy of a relationship with God will deny it for you. Will deny it to your face. All are equal within the covenant. Even those who are not formally within the covenant receive the same treatment. There is to be no discrimination against the sojourner in Israel. Indeed, the sojourner is to be protected. It is the laws that express the fundamental equality at Sinai. The laws apply to everyone in the community and not only to certain classes, in contrast to certain ancient Near Eastern laws like the Code of Hammurabi, those laws begin Shuma Awilum, if a man. And the man here is not every man. The man here is a man, it's a male, and it is a male of a certain class. And the laws apply to him. No class of individuals is privileged, although not every law applies to all individuals. Certain other laws explicitly prohibit favoring one class over another. Poor people are not to be favored over rich in court cases. It seems a little ironic, given experience. There are laws which seem to deny what, I want to acknowledge that there are laws which seem to deny what I have just said. The most embarrassing one for my case here, I suppose, are the laws that accept and regulate the practice of what might be called indentured servanthood. Israelites may sell themselves into servanthood for 7 years, presumably if their economic condition becomes so severe as to require it. Surely such laws accept either class or economic inequality, or both. It may be economic or it may be class, but it seems to be unequal. It does. I acknowledge it. But here's the thing. At the end of the 7 years, the servant must be restored to the community with no payment. The inequality must be ended. In a later version of the same law, in Deuteronomy, the law for a settled Israel, the servant must not just be set free, but must be set up in housekeeping by his or her former master. Some pots and pans to get started. And the things you need actually to rejoin and participate in the community. The final force of the law is to reestablish an equality within the community that had been disrupted by economic exigency. I should also concede the fact that women are treated differently in this law of servanthood. A woman who has been taken as a servant cannot be released. It sounds totally unfair, but the purpose of the law is to protect the woman. And please don't groan. People are rolling their eyes. Oh, sure. Oh, sure. But within the existing social structures, it is a protection. A woman released from service would not be marriageable and therefore would be without protection in that society. Requiring her to remain a servant prohibits her being cast into that vulnerable position. She is protected within the covenant community. It is, of course, no part of my argument that we are either to replicate the social structures of ancient Israel or even approve of any individual practices. We can judge these practices. It is clear even within the Bible that laws change through time and can be superseded and changed. Deuteronomy is a new code to address a new situation, people now resident in a land of their own. So that change can happen, and we are not bound to any one formulation. But I think we are deeply and properly affected by the covenantal vision of equality and justice that we receive from the Bible, and I want to include passion for justice and equality among the virtues that the Bible forms within the community of faith. That passion for justice based within the covenant community is trumpeted repeatedly in the prophetic literature. Listen to the words of Amos, who we sang this morning. We sang the words of, again, the service this morning was just reverberating to my thinking here. A passion for justice based within the community is trumpeted repeatedly in the prophetic literature, and here's Amos. Alas for those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches, and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David, improvise on instruments of music, who drink wine from bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. There are no prohibitions anywhere in the laws of any of the actions that Amos names. Amos is not here following the letter of the law, but instead he follows the passion for justice expressed through the laws, follows it beyond the boundaries of the law, seeing the implication of law. So long as some members of the society are indolent and pampered, while others are ruined, the society is profoundly unjust, and the centrality of the relationship to God in covenant is denied in practice. He accepts no moralizing escape clause. Those people who are ruined didn't work hard. They brought it on themselves. I can't help it if I'm lucky. All that matters is that his society, Amos's society, is fundamentally unequal, and by simple consequence, fundamentally unjust. So judgment will come. That judgment comes from God, and the harshness of the judgment is shocking. Exile in that immediate passage from Amos, but just earlier in a more colorful mood, Amos announces that the offenders will be dragged into exile with hooks, even the last of them with fish hooks. As a fisherman, I can imagine that. I would like to take on here one of the most disturbing elements of the Old Testament literature, the violence and a relentless quality of God's anger and punishment. We are shocked by God's violence, particularly in the prophetic literature. In a world overtaken by violence, we are disturbed by God's modeling that violence. I think there is an ongoing and absolutely necessary discussion whether the violence of the biblical language can be sustained and whether it justifies and feeds the violence of our world. But the force of that language, however we struggle with that discussion, is to reveal God's passion for justice. Whether the society Amos addresses is riven with inequality and oppression is not a matter of indifference to God. God's anger is aroused, and God brings judgment on the people for breaching the covenant relationship. God does not turn a blind eye to oppression, nor tolerate an inequality that denies the nature of the holy nation that God sought to create. God's passion for justice both originates and reinforces the prophetic passion for justice, which forms a central biblical virtue. I want to mention briefly, and I will do it briefly, just one more biblical virtue. In Isaiah 2, we read, "In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hill. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction,' Torah, 'and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This famous passage comes just at the end of a full chapter of accusation and excoriation of Israel for all manner of injustice and faithlessness. The natural conclusion is judgment and punishment, and it is certainly threatened repeatedly in the preceding chapter. "I will pour out my wrath on my enemies and avenge myself on my foes," God vows. But here, closely following the threat, a new time blossoms, a time of restoration, of all nations streaming together to receive God's instructions, a time of peace and harmony, swords reworked into plowshares. Days are coming, and they are completely under the sign of God's promise. God will transform the times. God will transform the times. These promises of God engender in those who receive them an eschatological hope and trust. The future is securely in God's hands. Fear and uncertainty are unjustified. People who have received these promises of God can sit somewhat lightly towards the future, trusting in God's ultimate direction. Let me say very quickly then what I have been arguing, and then I will move on to some reflections on the place of biblical virtues in public life, what we often subsume under the term of public theology. I've tried to draw out of the broad range of biblical passages a few, not all, central virtues that I believe the Bible instills in those who regard it as normative scripture. I mentioned chesed and a passion for justice and eschatological hope, and I tried then to show how these virtues were associated with particular biblical models of community, both familial and covenantal. My conviction is that these virtues both give shape to the Christian community and direct its action toward the sorts of goods that Alistair MacIntyre took as defining the function of virtues. Such virtues underlie the implicit code that governs the actions and activities of particular communities, the way the communities actually work. But here's the problem with which we must now wrestle. This set of distinctive virtues exists only within specific communities and cannot be assumed to be universal, either in scope or in recognition by other communities. There was a time, perhaps, when the values and virtues of Christendom were so dominant as to be regarded as universal. I myself doubt that there was ever any such true universality or uniformity, so that it was possible to speak of a Judeo-Christian tradition as if it were broadly recognized and uniform. But even granting that such a uniformity once existed, it no longer does. Our public world is comprised of many different communities, some of which are influenced by the biblical virtues and formed by them, some of which are rooted in the Quran or the Vedas, or no religious tradition at all, but broadly Enlightenment traditions of reason and natural law, and multicultural and their skeptical rejoinders. The public in public theology is a pluralistic and multicultural amalgamation of many different groups in which no single tradition, no single set of virtues and values is a priori privileged over any other. How does a community that is formed by the biblical virtues, which I have tried to depict, and many others, participate faithfully in such a public? That is our question, and here are only a few reflections. First, let me say that I am not going to consider how the biblical virtues structure the community of faith on a strictly internal basis. My topic is to look at the interaction with the public world. But even here, I think it is important to say that some expressions of the virtues of the biblical community are not dependent on much interplay with the broader community. When churches organize relief efforts after a Katrina, or apparently now a Gustav, or a death-dealing tsunami, they enter the public realm. They do truly enter the public realm. They enter the public realm in a manner informed by the biblical virtue that I talked about as chesed. Those who lost homes and loved ones are part of a common humanity. And that very relationship of commonality is sufficient to place us under obligation to respond, to express chesed towards other fellow human beings, whether of our community or not. Other groups may respond on the basis of their own traditions and values. There is certainly room for common effort and cooperation, but each group is really expressing its own distinct virtues, its own code, and there is no necessary cross-fertilization involved here. And I think and I want to say that that's legitimate. Sometimes the church just does what it does, working on its own internal developments and expressing its own internal life in the world. Another mode of participation in the public world is through a largely informal persistence of biblical values within the broader community, which the community of faith can continue to support. Let me give an example to unpack that a little bit. The government's policy on the detention and interrogation of prisoners in the anti-terrorism war has met a great deal of opposition in the United States since 9/11. Not complete, but a lot of opposition. That opposition, I would judge, is partly rooted in what I called a passion for justice. The insistence within the Christian community, and the Jewish community certainly as well, that all within society be treated equally. It runs deep. That biblical passion for justice has been connected through time with the American system of jurisprudence, meant to guarantee equal treatment to all, which seeks to ensure fair treatment, and with traditions as disparate as the Magna Carta and our own Declaration of Independence. It has not stayed isolated, but has interacted. The community of faith can continue this reinforcement of the now broader virtue of justice, the shared virtue of justice, as many church bodies have done, in a sense reinforcing a deep-seated code that cannot endorse human torture or the suspension of fundamental human rights, even in a time of national peril. Finally, the community of faith may participate in overt and explicit debates over public policy on the same basis as other traditions and communities. I said earlier, the age of Christendom, if there was such a thing, when Christian bodies could simply dictate to other participants in the dialogue, is dead, although some are still nostalgic for it, and some of them haven't got the news yet. Still, although Christian values and virtues cannot dictate, they have a seat at the table, and they have an integrity at the table. If Christian values are coherent, they can be articulated to those who don't share the same stories and traditions that underpin the Christian values and virtues. Appeal to divine sponsorship will not support the Christian position in that open debate with others who do not share Christian faith commitments, although it can invigorate and encourage the Christian community. That point seems to me very important. God is not an argument. God is our rock. Finally, I want to think a little theologically about the way in which Christians participate in policy debates. The model I presented above made it sound like policy debate was just a matter of logical argument. as if politics were something akin to logic or maybe even mathematics. You put in your argument and out comes the answer. Maybe we'd all like to think that as we argue our cases, and I think we persuade ourselves that it should be like that. But we all know deep in our heart that it isn't true. Public policy is a rough and tumble affair in which decisions and directions are set less by logical argument than by the application of power, sometimes raw power. I think that's a fear that haunts us in this multicultural age, that all it will do is give free rein to power relationships. Power trumps argument. Christians have a curious relationship with power. On the one hand, there is a realistic recognition of the force of different sorts of power, of forces for both good and bad, often understood for bad, the principalities. But on the other hand, Christians traditionally continually invert and subvert the ways that power is exercised in the world. The most telling subversion of power, the normative subversion of power, takes place at the death of Jesus. Jesus is in the garden. A detachment of soldiers arrives to arrest him. The world's most formidable power is afoot. A follower of Jesus draws a sword and takes a cut. Jesus tells him to put up his sword. Do you not know that I could summon 10 legions of angels? Contravening power is available, but Jesus refuses to summon it. He's led away. On the cross, Jesus is subject to the powers of all the mighty forces in the world, the Roman Empire, the religious authorities of his own people, even the pathetic power of the crowd. If you are Christ, come down. Jesus refuses and submits himself to the powers arrayed against him, and thereby triumphs, defeating those forces on the only issue that matters, the power of death. A new form of power is released into the world, a new eschatological hope. All of us know the power of that hope in our individual lives. It is the gift of Christ for our salvation. But the hope and assurance that the cross brings also transforms our public lives and our participation in the public arena, subverting our easy acceptance of the rationalizations of power into a commitment to a higher power, to a different understanding of our interaction with those we meet in dialogue. Our confidence lies not in the superiority of our arguments, nor the numbers and influence of our supporters, but in a cross that says all power yields to God's gracious purposes. In trusting the purposes of God and the way that God achieves God's purposes, we find a profound and unaffected humility that can transform the public arena. But still more, we recognize a fundamental truth about our participation in the world. All our civic virtues and all our public theology stand under the sign of the cross. They flow from the cross as their font and origin. Thank God. Thank you.